Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to respond to a video that tries to defend the morality of so-called Islamic sex with slaves. It is by one Dr. Imran, a medical doctor who is active in the British street dawah scene. This video itself is actually a response to another video made by a former Muslim, Abu Adam, explaining how he abandoned Islam because of his disgust over this very issue of sex with slaves and his inability to defend it as a Muslim. Abu Adam's video in fact focuses on one particular hadith that claims one particular Quranic verse, Surah 424, was revealed in order to give permission for Muslims to have sex with female captives that were still married. For context, this is the hadith in question. According to the hadith, after the Battle of Hunan, a group of women and children were captured, and the Muslim men were reluctant to have sex with the female captives because they were already married. It was at this moment, according to the hadith, that Surah 424 was revealed saying, "All married men are forbidden to you, save those captives whom your right hands possess." For Abu Adam, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, and was what caused him to leave Islam. Dr. Imran, in his video, then attempts to refute the arguments made by Abu Adam by mounting a rather heroic defense of the entire institution of Islamic concubinage. Okay, let's get started.
So his claim is this. He says that the Quran and Muhammad, peace be upon him, teach that it is permissible, he likes to say the word halal after saying permissible, that it is permissible to capture and rape female war captives, even if they're married and even if their non-Muslim husbands are still alive and present. Now I find this very surprising for somebody who claims to have studied Islam for 16 years, has claimed to have investigated allegations and criticisms further to come with the conclusion that Abu Adam has come with. It's bizarre, but let's examine the argument, and I'm going to make 4 basic points.
Spoiler alert, the only bizarre thing here is that in the entire 38 minutes of this video, Dr. Imran doesn't really even address brother Abu Adam's argument, let alone refute it. This is basically just a big, long-winded, tedious strawman argument. But I'll explain in more detail as we go along. But in any case, let's examine the 4 arguments he wants to present.
So let me deal with the first point in a bit more detail. This argument is an implicit argument. And what do I mean by this? That this is based upon furtive imagination and suggestions and insinuations, but there are actually no explicit statements at all to say that any war captive who was female was ever raped by any Muslim man.
For those who are not living in actual reality, including it seems, Dr. Imran, let me point out some home truths. These women we are talking about were literal prisoners. And even worse than that, they were prisoners in which Islamic law explicitly earmarked as the sexual property of their masters. I'll repeat. These women were the legal sexual property of their male masters. This is a fact of Islamic law that not even Dr. Imran would dispute. Given this reality, allow me to point out the bleeding obvious. That such women in this situation do not have any real agency when it comes to consenting to sex with their masters. But don't just take my word for it, why don't we see what actual experts in this field have to say about this? For example, the leading scholar in this field, Dr. Kosher Ali says, the category of rape doesn't apply for slaves. Ownership makes sex lawful. Consent is irrelevant. And also Dr. Jonathan Brown, himself a traditionalist Muslim. A male owner or a female slave has the right to sexual access to her. Her consent would be meaningless since she is a slave. So for people like Dr. Imran to sit there with a straight face and claim that, within this context, the burden of proof is on those who claim that rape is simply the reality, is an interesting perspective, to say the least. For most sane-minded people, simply citing the numerous incidents in hadithic literature of companions capturing and having sex with their slaves is evidence enough of rape taking place. But if he really insists on a specific example, I refer Dr. Imran to this hadith that mentions one of the more distasteful sexual encounters involving the revered sahabi, Ali. The hadith, which appears in Bukhari as well as other collections, describes a dispute between Ali and another sahabi, who was angry at Ali for having sex with a girl who had just been captured in war, because he had apparently not observed the required waiting period for having sex with slaves. As to why he didn't observe any waiting period, we turn to Ibn Hajar's Fath al-Bari, a well-regarded and trusted book of hadithic commentary. In explaining this hadith, Ibn Hajar points out that the waiting period, known as istibra, was not necessary in this case because the girl was prepubescent and therefore no waiting period is required. Oh yes, you heard me right, this much revered and widely cited commentator is literally saying that Ali had sex with a prepubescent child who had just been taken as prisoner, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. But even more disturbing than this is what follows, where Ibn Hajar casually states that this was in accordance with the practice of many companions before him.
Tell me you did not just say that.
And I don't need to point out to Dr. Imran the importance Islamic law supposedly places in ensuring women are fully mature and ready before they are able to engage in sexual relationships. Here he is in a street dawah video, painstakingly explaining to a non-Muslim the strict criteria that husbands must observe before being allowed to consummate their marriage. He points out that women must not only be physically mature, i.e. not prepubescent, but also emotionally and cognitively mature.
The first criteria is physical maturity. Yes. The second criteria is social maturity, societal maturity. So being able to function as an adult within the society. Socially competent, that means you're cognitively competent, you're psychologically competent, you're emotionally competent to perform the functions of an adult.
Adult functions such as having sex, right?
How do we determine both of those two criteria, biological maturity and social maturity? How do we do that? Biological one's easy. You wait for puberty.
Which Ali did not, according to Ibn Hajar.
How do we determine societal maturity? How do we determine that? So the society determines it, and for the individual it would be the parents that determine it.
So Dr. Imran, do you think we should consult with the parents of a prepubescent slave who had just been captured, whether or not they think they consider her mature enough to be raped, to have consensual sexual intercourse with her new Muslim owner? Oh, that's right, the father has probably already been killed by the Muslim conquerors, and her mother is probably preoccupied being raped, having loving consensual sexual intercourse with the same man that killed her husband and helped raise her village. And if he agrees, like any normal human being would, that she was completely unprepared and indeed had no agency to consent to sex with Ali, is that then a good example of rape? And if not, why not?
So now to deal with point 2. Now point 2 is very important because it deals with the historicity of the events of the Battle of Hunain and what happened at Al-Tas. And Abu Adam's claim is completely refuted by examining the history of the events.
So without going into all the gory details, Dr. Imran here goes into a fairly lengthy history lesson about the Battle of Hunain, which was the historical event surrounding the alleged revelation of verse 424 and the alleged permission given to Muslims to have sex with their already married slaves. So here he basically spends around 10 minutes explaining that in this historical incident, these particular women were never distributed to the men to have sex with. And in fact, all the women and children were eventually freed after their menfolk came back for them. He seems to think this somehow refutes the actual point Abu Adam was making, which is that this verse sets a legal precedent for allowing men to have sexual rights to captured women who were already married. This is in fact not in dispute. All the doctor is showing us is that in this particular occasion, the men did not take those particular women as sexual partners. But not because there was any overarching law for them not to, as the hadith itself says, they had that legal right. But only because on that particular occasion, the Prophet was able to negotiate their release back to their community. So this is in fact a complete strawman argument, and therefore irrelevant. Dr. Imran is never able to refute the key point, that this hadith allows Muslims, under Islamic law, to have sexual access to captured women who are already married. And in fact, he openly admits later that women who were separated from their husbands, who he euphemistically described as abandoning them, were free game for Muslims.
Point number 3. Now this point specifically deals with the claims brought by Abu Adam that have led to his doubts by providing evidence from the Quran and also specific statements and rulings by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the hadith, as well as specific rulings by the companions of the Messenger, may God be pleased with them, that go against the notions that he has brought. So let me start by providing these evidences for you. So my first evidence will be a verse from the Quran, chapter 4, Surah An-Nisa, verse 36. And I'll read it to you now. Worship Allah and associate nothing with him, and to parents do good, and to relatives, orphans, the needy, the near neighbour, the neighbour further away, the companion at your side, the traveller, and those whom your right hands possess. Indeed, Allah does not like those who are self-deluding and boastful. So here we have a very clear statement of what from God within the Quran, that you have to worship Allah alone without partners. And then we are giving a list of 9 groups of people who you have to do good to. So why is this relevant? And why is it relevant in this particular discussion? Because, as I will evidence later, rape is considered to be a crime and therefore is not a good thing. There is a clear instruction from God within the Quran to do good to those whom your right hands possess, and that obviously would exclude raping them, which is the opposite of that.
Firstly, in regards to this issue, this Quranic verse he quotes is vague to the point of being completely useless. What does "be good to" actually mean in the context of slaves? Personally, I would consider taking advantage of these vulnerable women for your own sexual desires as violating this Quranic injunction. It is obviously something that is wildly open to interpretation. Secondly, he makes the point that rape is a crime, and therefore committing such a crime must necessarily be in violation of this Quranic command. He assumes, though incorrectly, that in that time, forcing your slave to have sex with you was considered rape and a crime. In purely legal terms, that's not how rape was defined in classic Islamic law. Rape was in fact defined as a property crime, whereby someone would take, by force, something that is not rightfully theirs. Such is the case of a man raping another man's wife or slave. There is absolutely no concept of the crime of a man forcing himself onto what is legally his rightful sexual property, namely his wife or his slave. No doubt, it may be frowned upon morally, but it is not a crime under Islamic law. And we will see later how the doctor misconstrues this property crime with the non-existent moral crime of a master forcing his slave to have sex with him.
The second point that I'm going to make, and it deals with those under your care, including the female slaves that you have. And I'll read it. And this is chapter 24 of the Quran. Chapter 24, yes, Surah An-Nur, and this is verse number 32. So let me read that to you. And it says, and marry the unmarried among you, the righteous among your male slaves and female slaves. And this is a portion of the verse. Now, other translations will read, arrange the marriage of the spouseless among you, and the capable from among your bondswomen and bondsmen, or bondsmen and bondswomen. And this verse is actually about arranging the marriage of those whom your right hands possess. So if you read Ma'arif al-Quran by Muhammad Shafi, this is in his 6th volume, page 423 and page 424, when dealing with this verse specifically. It says, and there's an explanation, and this is very interesting to understand. So it is incumbent upon the masters of the slaves and the slave girls that those among them who have the ability to get married, their marriage should be arranged. So here we have a command from the verse in the Quran, which is explained as, arrange the marriage of those who are in your care, who are your servants. Again, completely going against the notion of women being captured for sexual objectification and sexual gratification. In fact, you're doing the opposite. You're arranging for these men and for these women specifically to, if they desire, get married as they desire.
So the Quran, and also some Islamic jurists, encourage slave owners to marry off their slaves. That's great. But does that mean it definitely happened in practice? Of course not. It also conveniently dodges the fact that before they were married off, which could take months, even years, their masters had complete and exclusive access to them sexually. As for his idea that it completely goes against the idea of women being captured for sexual objectification, sexual gratification, 2 points. A. Under Islamic law, masters were under no obligation whatsoever to marry off their slaves, even if it was encouraged. And B. As mentioned, they had all that time before they arranged the marriage to get as much sexual gratification from them as they wished. But why don't we look at Islamic sources themselves to get an idea of how accurate his portrayal of female slaves not being about sexual gratification really is? Exhibit A, this notorious hadith from the Sahih Muslim collection, which describes the rather distasteful dilemma some companions faced after capturing some women, as they didn't know if they should practice coitus interruptus while they raped, had consensual sexual intercourse with them. Note the language the narrator uses to describe these women, excellent Arab women, whom they desired sexually. Or Exhibit B, a hadith graded as Sahih by Albani, which says that whenever Ibn Umar, son of the great Sahaba and Caliph Umar, purchased a female slave, he would uncover her leg and put his hand between her breasts and on her buttocks. And in another account the same Ibn Umar is quoted as saying, "On the day of the Jalala battle I won a slave girl, her neck was like a silver ewe. I couldn't control myself, I immediately jumped on her and began kissing her, while the people were looking at me." Does this sound like the attitudes and behaviours of men who are only interested in looking after the welfare of these women by finding them suitable husbands?
So the next piece of evidence, this is looking at someone who was mistreated by their owner. So here we have a statement from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or a report about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, recorded in Sahih Muslim, book 15. This is hadith number 4082. Hilal bin Yasaf reported that a person got angry and slapped his slave girl, whereupon Suad bin Muqarin said to him, "You could find no other part to slap but the prominent part of her face. See, I was one of the 7 sons of Muqarin, and we had but one slave girl. The youngest of us slapped her, and Allah's Messenger commanded us to set her free." So here we have a slave girl who is owned, and her owners abused her by slapping her. And when this matter was brought to the attention of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he ordered her to be freed. I want you to think about this. If the Prophet Muhammad ordered the freeing of the slave girl just for merely being slapped, do you think that he would have allowed her to be raped? Think about it. It does not make any sense. The argument being put forward does not make any sense whatsoever.
While I don't want to get bogged down on this one hadith, as I don't think this single anecdote proves anything much of relevance, I will just point out that this is an oversimplification of the issue. Firstly, if we read all versions of this hadith, the real discretion seems not to be slapping per se, but rather specifically slapping a prominent part of the face. Furthermore, we find another hadith within the same book in Muslim, where a man is not merely slapping his slave, but actually using a whip to beat him. In that hadith, the Prophet does not order the slave to be freed, he merely warns the man that Allah has more control over him than he has over the slave, and leaves it at that. The final point on this is that elsewhere in the hadith literature we find what seems to be tacit approval of beating female slaves, perhaps as long as it's not the face. So in Sunan Abu Dawud, graded Sahih, we see, "Do not beat your wife as you beat your slave girl." In short, the issue is not as clear-cut and simple as the doctor makes it out to be. But it's worth exploring his broader point about whether the Prophet would allow rape of slaves if he doesn't even allow slapping of slaves. On the surface, this is obviously a powerful sentiment, and no doubt works in the sort of sensationalist, street dawah type work that Dr. Imran engages in. But really all we have to do is tune our minds into the culture, values, and norms of 7th century Arabic culture. A setting in which we already established that female slaves were the lawful sexual property of their masters. And moreover, a setting in which there is not a single known legal utterance in any Islamic book of law stating that those slaves had any sort of right to consent. Once we understand this, we start to appreciate how, what we define today as rape, by a man against his lawful sexual property, i.e. his slave, was considered within that society, or rather, wasn't considered. And soon the notion that slapping a slave is actually considered morally worse than physically raping them becomes not so absurd.
And let's look at an example of a companion making a ruling about somebody who does have illicit sexual intercourse with a slave girl that had been captured in war. What happened to that person? And this is recorded in Bayhaqi's Al-Kubra hadith collection, and this is in volume 9, page 177, hadith number 18222. Khalid sent Diral bin al-Azwar in a party. They attacked an area of the tribe of Bani Asad. They captured a pretty woman. Dirar liked her. Hence he asked his companions to grant her to him, and they did so. He then had sexual intercourse with her. When he completed his mission, he felt guilty, and went to Khalid and told him what he had done. Khalid said, I permit her for you and make it lawful to you. He, Dirar, said, no, not until you write to Umar about this. Khalid then informed Umar about this, and Umar wrote back saying that he, Dirar, should be stoned to death. By the time Umar's message reached Dirar, Dirar had already died, and Khalid said Allah did not want to disgrace Dirar, and which is why he died before the punishment could be carried out. But here we have a specific statement of an impropriety happening in a battle. A woman is captured. One of the men liked the woman, and then he had her allocated to him in war booty, and then he actually had sexual relations with her. As soon as that was done, he knew he had done wrong. He felt guilty. He spoke to his commander and informed him, who tried to give him a way out. But actually the person said, no, I want you to inform the Khalif, who was Umar at the time. And Umar specifically gave the ruling. He said, stone him to death, because what he's done is not allowed in Islam. And what had he done? He had sexual relations with a slave girl when it was not his right to do so.
I'm genuinely at a loss as to what point Dr. Imran is trying to make with this example. I mean, what is the actual crime being committed here? Is he saying that slave girls were not to be taken for sex? Well, no. We know already that this is acceptable under Islamic law. The only crime that seems to have happened here is that this man had sex with a slave before she had been allocated to him. Not that she couldn't be raped, be made available for consensual sexual relations with her Muslim master. So this example has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not the girl can or can't be raped. It's only about the proper procedure that must be adhered to before a slave girl is accessible sexually to her Muslim master. But what does this hadith really say of relevance on this matter? Read the account closely, particularly in relation to the attitude towards this man who had apparently committed such a grave crime. We see that his commander, Khalid, tried to dismiss the issue, and upon hearing that he had taken the girl for himself, simply told him to consider her allocated to him. And even afterward got back from the Caliph that he should be stoned. After he died, Khalid remarked, Allah did not want to disgrace him. So here we have what Dr. Imran tries to portray as a heinous crime against a slave, and yet we have the man's own commanding officer apologizing for him and trying to sweep it under the carpet. What does this say about the prevailing culture within Muslim ranks in regards to excusing or turning a blind eye to such indiscretions around sex with slaves?
So the last piece of evidence that I want to give you in this section is to do with what to do with somebody who does not please you from amongst your slaves. And the Prophet Muhammad made a ruling here, and this is recorded in Sunan of Abu Dawood. This is book number 41, hadith number 5142. Abu Dar narrated, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, feed those of your slaves whom please you from what you eat, and clothe them with what you clothe yourselves, but sell those who do not please you, and do not punish Allah's creatures. So the idea that you can somehow force somebody to have sexual intercourse with you when they don't desire it would go completely against the statement of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, here.
Hang on a minute, did he just interpret this ruling to be about the female slave's sexual wants and needs? That has nothing to do with it. The hadith specifically mentioned the Muslim who owned the slave and their desires. Nothing is mentioned about the slave's desires. Listen again.
From what you eat, and clothe them with what you clothe yourselves, but sell those who do not please you, and do not punish Allah's creatures.
Sell those who do not please you. Not what pleases the slave. Or in other words, you have sex with your slave. You don't really enjoy it. The slave doesn't please you sexually. So you sell her. Note, it's not freeing her, merely selling her to another owner, who then has rightful legal access to her vagina.
So now on to the fourth and final point, and this point really is to illustrate that the argument presented by Abu Adam completely contradicts the known rights of the war captives as laid out by the early Islamic scholars. And I'm going to make 4 sub-points in this, and I'll evidence those as I'll go. So let me begin. So Islam forbids the killing of women and children in war. Why is that important in this particular discussion? Well, killing women and children is an option that some peoples of the past have taken in war scenarios. This is not an option open to Muslims because it's been specifically forbidden, which is why then they're not abandoned in hostile environment in a theatre of war. They are taken to a place of security and safety. And this is very important as it sets out the reason why captives were taken. There were no formal prison systems at that time, and what would then happen is that the government of the time would allocate any war captives to households within the society to act as servants, essentially.
This point is always made by sex slave apologists. That because war captives were an unfortunate fact of life, and because Islam forbids killing women and children, therefore taking in these captives as servants to Muslim households was an unavoidable fact of life. These are all valid points, and I take no issue with them. What I do take issue with is why they think that this unfortunate, yet unavoidable fact of needing to deal with war captives somehow requires slave masters having sex with their slaves. Why is it even a thing? I mean, these apologists argue passionately about the needs and well-being of these captives, right? So after you take them in, allocate them to a household, and require them to earn their keep as servants, that should be where it ends. Having sex with them is entirely irrelevant to the "we are just taking care of them" argument. There simply is no logic in the idea that sex with these slaves has anything to do with the necessary requirement of dealing with and accommodating war captives.
To the second point, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, and Imam Ash-Shaybani, who was the student of Imam Abu Hanifa, all hold the opinion, and these are very early Islamic scholars, all hold the opinion that if a husband and wife are captured together in battle, then their marriage is deemed to be continuing, and obviously then no sexual relations are allowed with either of them.
2 points about this. Firstly, this seems to be a minority view amongst the major Sunni schools. According to IslamicStudies.info, there is disagreement, however, among jurists as to what should be done if both husband and wife have been taken captive together. Abu Hanifa and the jurists of his school are of the opinion that their marriage should remain intact. Malik and Shafi, on the other hand, argue that their matrimonial contract should be rendered void. Somehow the good doctor forgot to mention this clear difference of opinion within the major Sunni schools, and instead disingenuously insinuated that this was a unanimous view amongst scholars. The second point is that this ruling covers only one possible scenario where a married woman is captured in war. Another, and frankly more realistic scenario, is one in which the husband and wife become separated because of the war. And in this scenario, there is no dispute amongst the jurists. The marriage is considered void, and the female captive is free game to be taken sexually by her Muslim master.
Now, the third thing I want to evidence is a little bit about the procedure of how any distributions would occur. Now, the men have fled, as was evidenced earlier, left the women in the battlefield and with their children.
Whoa, hang on there. You're not seriously suggesting that this was the only scenario in which female captives could be taken, are you? Note the sneaky shifting of the blame here. It was the women's menfolk who abandoned them. It's all their fault. Therefore Muslims bear no responsibility if they want to take advantage of them sexually. Is that really the argument here?
And what then happens is that these are taken captives and they're essentially held until they can be taken out of the theatre of war, before then a distribution would take place. Once a distribution happens, there then begins a waiting time. Abu Adam is trying to give the idea that as soon as the battle was over, these women were immediately raped, and this has been refuted completely. And this is very straightforward. So the idea that somehow these women were immediately raped is a completely false idea.
Right, so Islamic law states that these women must be properly processed and undergo the appropriate waiting period before they are made available for sex. So this seems like a good argument against the idea that female captives can be raped, at least not in the immediate aftermath of being captured. Unfortunately, we just have to look at the readily available evidence from Islam's own historic literature to see how prepared Muslims were to blatantly flout these processes. Starting with Dr. Imran's own evidence of a Muslim soldier ignoring the required slave distribution process and helping himself to a girl that he desired, followed by his commanding officer attempting to sweep it under the carpet. Then of course we have the previously mentioned incident of Ali having his way with a prepubescent girl on the very same day that she was captured. And thirdly, the other previously mentioned hadith of the companions deliberating about whether they should practice coitus interruptus on the women they had just captured. 3 separate accounts of Muslims completely disregarding any waiting period and or seemingly bypassing the proper distribution process. And that's not even mentioning the disgusting accounts of Ibn Umar fondling slave girls before he bought them and slobbering all over a newly captured female slave because he found her irresistible. It seems such highly regarded procedures, supposedly designed to protect the captives from abuse, are not worth the paper they are written on.
And the final point that I want to make is that rape is clearly considered by Islam to be a crime that carries a very serious punishment. So first let me give you 2 opinions of classical Islamic scholars. So this is the view of Imam Malik, who was the founder of the Maliki school of jurisprudence. And he states in his Muwatta, volume 2, page 734, in our view, the man who rapes a woman, regardless of whether she is a virgin or not, if she is a free woman, he must pay a dowry, like that of her peers, and if she is a slave, he must pay her whatever has been detracted from her value. The punishment is to be carried out on the rapist, and there is no punishment for the woman who has been raped, whatever the case. The second evidence is from Imam Shafi, who was the founder of the Shafi'i school of thought, and this is found in Kitab al volume 3, page 253. If a man acquires by force a slave girl, then has sexual intercourse with her after he acquires her by force, and if he is not excused by ignorance, then the slave girl will be taken from him. He is required to pay the fine, and he will receive the punishment for illegal sexual intercourse. And I repeat again, we know what the punishment is because that was the ruling of Umar against Darir when he did the same. So it's very clear that Islam does not allow rape of women, whether they are slaves or not.
I have dealt with using the Shafi ruling as evidence against raping slaves in a previous video, and the Malik ruling here is clearly along the same lines. Basically, use of these 2 rulings is the most egregious case of taking rulings out of context to the point of being completely misleading. Let's be absolutely clear about this. Neither the Shafi ruling or the Malik rulings are concerned with any crime against the slave. The specific category of crime being discussed in both rulings is one of violation of property rights. Namely the property rights of the slave owner, and specifically, the taking, for sex, a slave by someone who is not the legal owner of that slave. It is a crime against the slave owner because their rightful property was unlawfully damaged. And therefore, the fine that the perpetrator had to pay was paid to the slave owner as compensation for loss of value of their property. The law never applied to the slave owner in relation to their own slave, and, therefore, this law is completely irrelevant to the issue of a slave owner raping their own slave. I repeat, completely irrelevant. As a final point, I'd like to circle back to a previous argument that the doctor relies so heavily on and explore it from a different angle. Recall how he made such a big deal of the fact that both the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet command slaves be treated well. And he makes the apparent slam-dunk point that if the Prophet strictly forbade slapping a slave, how could he possibly condone raping them?
I want you to think about this. If the Prophet Muhammad ordered the freeing of the slave girl just for merely being slapped, do you think that he would have allowed her to be raped? Think about it. It does not make any sense. The argument being put forward does not make any sense whatsoever.
While I dealt with this specific point, one could derive from this a more general argument that not raping slaves was such an obvious point that it simply went without saying, and that's why there is a complete absence of the issue in any Islamic legal text. My response to this is that the issue of consent in sexual relationships is actually raised by classic Islamic jurists in several different contexts. Some of these include contraception, where most jurists agree consent is required with wives, but not with slaves. Marrying slaves off, where jurists are unanimous that the slave's consent is not necessary. And even the issue of sex in marriage is considered, where most jurists agree that consent with the wife should be sought, although no punishment is specified in the case where a husband forces himself on his wife sexually. The point here is that in light of these rulings, it would be an incredible strain of logic to conclude that slave masters requiring consent to have sex with their slaves is a fact that goes without saying. If slave masters do not require their slaves' consent when they marry them off to someone else, how on earth could you claim that they nonetheless need consent to have them sexually, for themselves? Furthermore, the fact that jurists felt the need to raise the issue of consent in marriage strongly suggests that they didn't consider that consent in marriage was already a foregone conclusion. If this was the case, how ridiculous then is the idea that consent with slaves is a fact that goes without saying, even while consent with wives isn't. In conclusion, this defensive, Islamic, sex with slaves by Dr. Imran does little more than prosecute arguments that were not even raised by his opponent and bring up rulings in Islamic law that are either irrelevant or hopelessly out of context. Or in other words, a pretty typical apology of some of the worst aspects of Islamic law by a traditionalist Muslim. Probably the most useful thing we get from his video is that it provides an interesting insight into the warped and misguided moral compass of these traditionalist apologists. Especially their seeming inability to understand how the world really works and a singular inability to empathize with true victims such as those who are made into slaves and raped. Thanks for watching and feel free to comment, like, and subscribe to this channel.